Well, good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads, episode 112. Hard to believe, Friday, July 8th, 2022. Thank you for joining us today. Hopefully you are joining us from some sandy beach somewhere this wonderful summer day. Hope you had a good 4th of July last week. We had a great session, pre-recorded last week, live this week, just the way it should be. Our family was traveling, little family vacation, and got to go to a wedding as well, so we're thankful for that. We are right in the middle of our series on de-risking medical device development. We can take your questions live today, just like it should be, and we'll look forward to those as they come in. Today we're going to focus on a very important topic, de-risking regulatory strategy. Everyone knows it's important, but few know where the pitfalls are and how things go south. And worst of all, it's an area where you can think you're doing the right thing and then discover later on that, oh no, we're going to have to back up. That's one of the worst things you can find yourself up against. So we'll be talking about that, Q&A interspersed wherever you want. If you got questions, feel free to shoot them out there about the FDA, about how development de-risking works, any of the topics we've covered to date. Especially those in the regulatory space. Before we get there, really quick, the announcement that we've been making every week. Save the date for the Michigan Medical Device Summit coming up on Tuesday, September 20th of this year in Kalamazoo, Michigan, put on by MishBio. Always a great event. Glad to see it back in person, and we'll see you there in Kalamazoo. So here we are in our de-risking series. This is the third session we've had of this series. 3 more to go, including today. We're talking all about how do you get the risk out of medtech development. This week, regulatory strategy. How do you plan where you're going with respect to the US FDA? How do you know if you're on the right track? How do you know if there is a track? How do you figure that all out? Well, in the prior sessions, and those links there will take you to the YouTube videos for the 2 prior sessions, we talked about what is de-risking, a definition we'll repeat today. We also talked about when does de-risking apply, and the answer is pretty much all the time. We talked about frameworks for sense-making. We talked about GTD, or getting things done, as well as the Cynefin framework, which we'll remind you of today. And last week, we talked about design controls. That's FDA design controls. That's out of 21 CFR 820.30 for that mouthful. And why that's a good vehicle for de-risking in the process of medical device development. Why is it that what FDA has actually given us to follow actually makes sense? Hate to say that, not everything makes sense. But actually that as a framework and as a vehicle for getting someplace is actually quite sane and sensible. So we talked about that last week. If you want to see those videos, just scan with your phone those QR codes up there, and it'll take you right to those videos. Well, I want to remind you of 2 of those sense-making frameworks, or rather the sense-making framework of Cynefin. And this is one that we'll reference again today as we talk about regulatory de-risking. Now, FDA doesn't talk about Cynefin. It's just something that in the industry is well known as a way to understand where you are. Are you in a domain of best practices, in a clear domain? Are you in a chaotic domain? Well, guess what? Most of the time, you're not actually in either of those. You're usually in a complicated or a complex domain. And those domains require trying something, watching the result, and based on the result that you see, you have a clue where you are. Then you can respond in a more nuanced, more specific way and get to where you're going. And one of the great secrets, if you will, although here we are telling you, one of the great secrets of project management in medtech in general, and regulatory, as well as in design controls, is to understand where you are. Are you in a complicated domain, in a complex domain, in a clear domain? That would be lovely. Or in a chaotic domain. And the goal is to get as quickly to a clear domain as you can, but assuming that you're there before you really are is how many projects get set back. So the goal is not to turn things into research projects, but the goal is to understand accurately where you are to be able to move it forward. We'll talk today about some specific ways in the regulatory world that you can understand whether you're on a clear track with FDA or whether you just like to think you are. And I'll tell you what, many times we've seen companies that think they're on a clear track with FDA because they heard back from the agency, not understanding that some of the code words that were used means that the path is anything but clear. So that's a word again about the Cynefin framework. We talked last week about how do design controls help, and just this visual reminder that design controls are simply a rigorous way to walk through the intended use of your device. What are you going to say about it? The needs of the user, the risks associated with your device, what your product code is, what your standards are, the design input requirements that emerge from all of this. And then later product development has a reason for existing. It has a thing to reference back to. And the way you reference back is not only through your documentation, but also through verification and validation. There's actually a vehicle for getting where you want to go. So today, here we are talking about regulatory de-risking. Our agenda for today, first of all, things that people hear about the FDA. Maybe you've heard a few things. Then, the regulatory roadmap to hell. After that, the fundamental question or questions, actually we're going to give you two, to ask FDA. After that, the FDA's favorite non-answer. Stay tuned for that one. It's one of my favorites. Then a case study. After that, when you've done all you can, when you get to the point where you've done everything you can, what do you do at that point? And finally, a word about COVID's effects on the agency itself. Those effects have been non-trivial. We'll talk a little bit about what we've seen over the last year or so. So with that, what is de-risking, and why should we use this terminology when it comes to medical device development? Shouldn't we just say design or design thinking? Well, de-risking is actually very much at the heart of your stakeholders' interests and your interests if you're involved in the development of medical devices and medical technologies. The Oxford English Dictionary defines de-risking as making something safer by reducing the possibility that something bad will happen and that money will be lost. So if you can get to the end and something bad hasn't happened and money hasn't been lost, you're in a really good place with that product's development. That's why we think de-risking is an appropriate term to use to augment the idea of development. So like we've said before, if this has ever happened to you, you got through a competitive bid process, you did a project kickoff meeting, roles were assigned, months pass, and the project stagnates, this whole concept of de-risking is for you. In fact, anytime you suddenly discover that something is not as you thought it was, it's a good indication that there was a risk that wasn't identified, that popped up, that you were really in a complex or a complicated domain, to reference Cynefin, instead of a clear one that you hoped you were in. One more word about de-risking before we get into the specifics today. De-risking is something that has to be infused into your project in all areas of it. You can't just apply it like a sledgehammer. And that wouldn't be much help. It would slow you down. But if you infuse this kind of thinking all the way through your process, it's going to help to catch those areas that otherwise might get missed. Finally, this lesson from the woodshed that we keep talking about, there does come a point where the concept of de-risking is not really the right concept. For every problem you face, whether it's big or small, there comes a point where you do just have to push through and make it happen. You can clarify as much as you want, and there comes a point at which it will not get any better. You simply have to do something, try it, find out what happens. And so we need this as a bookend to this discussion of de-risking, because de-risking is a tool that leads you to specific actions. Actions you can believe are worthwhile and are going to push your project forward as fast and as efficiently as is possible. But there comes a point where doing that analysis isn't going to help you anymore. You have to push it. And the big thing is knowing, when does that point come? When do I take that action, put my money down and let the dice fall where they may. Well, let's go to this. Things that people hear about the FDA. The first one we'll start is this, and we don't hear this much anymore, but it frequently in past years is something that would come out. And for some who are dealing with the FDA today, this may make a resurgence, but we don't want to go there quite yet. The FDA, it's a black box. Now this mentality motivates a few different things. One is stay away for as long as you can. Now, if I take you back 15 years, that was generally people's attitude towards the FDA. Stay away for as long as you can. We heard things like, don't give them rope to hang you. Go to Europe first, because they're a faster regulatory process. Well, the last year accepted, FDA has generally gotten much better about its process. It's tried hard not to be a black box. Whereas in fact, the European Union, with the new medical device regulation supplanting the medical device directive, has actually gotten much, much more opaque. In general, we don't think that's a great first option for entities that otherwise want to be in the US. But the reality remains, there will always be an element of the FDA feeling like a black box. In some years it'll be better, in some years it will be worse. But for today, I would encourage you not to think this way. There is more that can be known. We want to know the limits of what we can know. And we also want to know when it's time to go to the woodshed and just do what needs to be done. Here's another one. The FDA is a hurdle. Well, that's true at some level. The FDA is a hurdle, and if they weren't there, there's a sense in which you could do a lot more things than you can do just by deciding you're going to go do it. But this mentality does lead to the same error we see at the top of the Cynefin mountain, which is the thought of a clear domain. To think that I'm accurately seeing the hurdle in front of me, as though the FDA were some monolithic hurdle, or as though there were a simple checklist that one could follow for a particular product type and then everything's going to be fine. So yes, the FDA is a hurdle. They're also at times a black box. But there are limitations to thinking about them primarily in that manner, because we don't want a checklist approach to FDA. Remember this Cynefin framework. This is something where we have to understand the complexities. We're going to talk in a minute about what's behind the scenes at FDA. It's a rather large organization with quite a few different departments in it. And to understand how those different departments think is quite a challenge. Here's an example that's probably slightly closer to on point. And that is, the FDA is your partner. Now, there's a limit to that. The FDA is your partner, but it was actually somebody rather high up at FDA who once said in a meeting I was at, we're not your buddy. We're not your friend. We are your trusted colleague. That's how they want to be thought of. But there is a difference. Think about it this way. Your friend, your buddy, somebody you can share your heart with, you're going to dump a lot of things that aren't really germane to the conversation just because you want to be heard and you want somebody to know how you're feeling. Would you be surprised to know that many companies approach FDA that way? Oh, it's our buddy and they're willing to talk to us. Let's dump all the thoughts we've ever had. Well, I don't need to tell you that doesn't end well. But maybe I do, because many companies that we see take this approach. Oh, I had this thought and I want to chat with FDA about it. That's not normally the best approach. There's a very specific way to approach FDA, and we're going to dive into detail in just a minute on what that approach is. There are some very specific ways that you can approach the agency. They're relatively simple. That'll help a lot. So again, the FDA is your partner. I think that is a good way to think about it. But they're not your buddy, they're not your friend. And that'll keep you to some pretty business-like interactions, ones that hopefully will make things clearer and not make them more complex than they need to be. I'll also just say that the FDA does need to succeed in its own right. And that brings us to the next one, that FDA changes. And that's very true. The FDA does change from year to year, from administration to administration. Think about it this way. If you had to run an agency where half the time you were being blamed for snake oil being sold and dangerous products making it through to the market, and half the time you were being blamed because life-saving innovations couldn't make it to the market in time, you might find yourself swinging like a pendulum too. And that's right where the agency is. During COVID, they couldn't get things out fast enough. Most of the time, however, if there's a product failure or something goes wrong, they and everyone else is going to hear about it. So the agency does swing a bit on a pendulum. The FDA does change. And so if every 3 to 5 years you discover a different wind, well, that's partly why that's true. And even then, when we talk about the FDA, it's not clear that it's a monolithic organization. In fact, way down in the organizational structure that I won't even bother to show you right now, sits the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. Now this is different from CBER, where biologics are regulated. It's different from CDER, where drugs are regulated. It's different from where they regulate alcohol and tobacco. And so you find yourself way down here in an organization that nevertheless at this level has 1,700 professionals working for it. It was recently reorganized in recent years into these following sections: the Office of Communication and Education, the Office of Management, the Office of Policy, the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality, which if you're trying to get your device cleared is where you're going to be spending some time, the Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories, and the Office of Strategic Partnerships and Technology Innovation. But OPEC, the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality, is somewhat of a super office. And as we drill down into that office of FDA, there's OHT, the Office of Health Technology, the Office of Regulatory Programs, and the Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis. And you thought we were done, but no, it goes deeper. Under OHT, there are 8 OHTs, OHT 1 through 8, and those are defined as follows. OHT 1 covers areas of ophthalmic, anesthesia, respiratory, ear, nose, and throat, and dental. OHT 2, cardiovascular. And the list goes on. Gastrorenal, obstetrics, gynecology, general hospital, urology under OHT 3. Surgical infection control under OHT 4. OHT 5 is neurological and physical medicine. OHT 6, orthopedic. In vitro diagnostics are under 7, and radiological health under 8. This is a gigantic organization, and it should go without saying once you've seen this chart to know that how a team who happens to be under OHT 7 is feeling today does not predict how a team that's under OHT 2 is feeling today. What pressures they are under may be very different. So what you're going to experience from the agency is really largely dictated by external pressures on the agency, but also on what the specific teams and divisions under OHT are feeling at any given time. So it's important to keep this in mind as you pursue a given clearance. Well, here's where it gets interesting. So how do you navigate this? Say, okay, I want an attitude where FDA is my partner, where FDA is not my buddy, but I want to work with them. I recognize, as many have said, there are humans at the other end. This is always good to keep in mind when working with anybody. A little bit of empathy goes a long way most of the time. And to recognize that there are humans with lives and families at the other end of that phone call, other end of that letter with FDA, that's really important. So we're charged up, we're going in, we're saying FDA is my partner. I want to approach my regulatory strategy with FDA as my partner. Great. How do I do it? Well, one of the most common ways is this. We like to call it the regulatory roadmap to HE double hockey sticks. Now, why do we go so melodramatic on that one? Because oftentimes that's what it turns into. Now, rightly, stakeholders ask, do you know your regulatory strategy? Have you gotten a regulatory roadmap? Can't blame them, because many innovators, although they may know the technology and they may know the market, haven't actually dug into how am I going to get this cleared? So it's an important question, no shame in asking it. But there's a lot of drawbacks to what happens next when you go out looking for a regulatory roadmap. And many people have heard the horror stories of companies that go out, get a few years in, and then have to back up because their documentation or their testing just wasn't up to snuff. Now, we could start here and give you an even more deep crash course in FDA, and that's not what we're going to do. Let's talk about how this usually plays out. Here's the problem with a regulatory roadmap. So why is a regulatory roadmap not a solution to de-risking your regulatory strategy? Just a few problems listed here. These are usually based on a very early idea of what the product is. Now, a good regulatory firm will write somewhere in there that if you change what your product is, this roadmap is going to change. But oftentimes, entrepreneurs and their stakeholders don't understand what changes are going to make what changes to their clearance process. And so it's just a drop in the sand. It's just a moment in time. And it's important to recognize that. Now, sadly, many times we've seen that these are often based on templates that aren't cleaned up. Somebody had a template that answered every question that could have been asked, and whoever was putting it together forgot to put some things in or rip some things out. Well, that's a problem because then it's actually objectively false when it gets to the company that wants to know what their FDA roadmap is. Oftentimes, these are not updated as the product concept changes during early development. And with alarming frequency, neither the person who put it together nor the startup they're working with knows how to actually walk the development pathway. So the words in the roadmap become dead ends. If we say we need to follow a consensus standard, what does that actually mean? How do you do that? Where in the development process do you make that happen? It's not much of a roadmap if all it is words. How do you understand what it is and what it does? Keep in mind, and this is a dangerous statement to make, that too much clarity can be bad for consultant work. What does this mean? It means that the real need up front is clarity. Would a roadmap be great? Yes, if it's accurate. What's more important, as we'll talk in a minute, is education. Do you understand where you are in the process? I'd rather have less of a roadmap that you understand than a gigantic roadmap that nobody understands and nobody knows how to implement. So let's talk about some better alternatives. Before we talk about how you actually interact with the FDA to de-risk your product development, it's nice to have a limited regulatory brief that does give you that point in time, but recognizes its limitations. It can't be omnibus. Extensive education about what this means. What does it mean? How do I actually implement it? And then, communication with FDA when appropriate. Now, I didn't say as soon as possible. Sometimes it's appropriate to wait to speak with the agency until later in the process. But when appropriate, it's actually communication with the agency that is the actual roadmap. Until you've spoken with the agency, you don't actually know what your product is likely to go through. Ask any innovator who's come up against the agency. You'll know that what they first thought about the process probably didn't pan out. So our goal as teams is to get to that FDA communication at a stage appropriate point that's actually going to give you the real roadmap to what you're up against. Now again, you don't rush to that as fast as you possibly can. You want to understand what the pathway could be. You want to understand the implications for your development process. And then strategically, carefully, you want to talk to the agency. Because when you can get head nodding out of the agency, that's when you know that your path is starting to be truly understood. Now, what does a regulatory brief want to contain? Well, we'd like to know what the intended use of your product is. We'd like to know possible predicates, if applicable. And if they're not, we should be talking about other pathways you might be following other than the 510(k) pathway. What are the possible product codes, if they exist? Do you know what the expected standards put forward by the agency are? Do you need a 510(k)? Is it required or is it not required? Are you exempt from it? Do you need design controls or are you exempt from it? Do you need good manufacturing practices or are you exempt from it? Do you need a PMA? I hope not, but do you need a pre-market approval? Or is there some avenue for health and wellness discretionary enforcement that the agency has created? This isn't an exhaustive list of all the alternatives that could be in here, but these are important things to understand. Now, the question here is, can you learn what this means? Having a document that lists all of these with a whole bunch of words around it that don't make any sense didn't get you to the goal of a regulatory roadmap, regulatory strategy, regulatory de-risking, regulatory planning. You have to understand what each of these mean. So as you study them, as you talk with people, as you ask questions on this show or anything else, make sure that you understand what the implication is. What is a 510(k)? What is its basis? Is it safety and efficacy? No, it's not. It's substantial equivalence, and that gets a lot of people in trouble. So education becomes the most important thing here. Make sure your management is educated. Make sure that your investors are educated, that your technical team is educated, and your other stakeholders are educated. That's what actual regulatory strategy and de-risking starts to look like. That what you do know is communicated and disseminated so that it can touch and affect your development process. And like we said before, communication with the agency is actually the regulatory roadmap. So an informational meeting, a pre-submission, a 513G, a breakthrough device pathway sprint discussion, a 510(k) or a de novo. These are the kinds of things that are going to make a difference in actually getting you boots on the ground information. So, is the FDA your partner? Yeah, that's probably the best way to think about it. But how do you communicate with the agency? What sorts of things do you say? What sorts of things do you not say? Well, that's what we're going to talk about next. Here's two fundamental questions that you can ask the agency. One is, we're planning to do X on the basis of Y, as described in detail in Z. Does the agency concur? Or how about this one? In document A, the agency stated that B, we propose to C, as described in detail in D. Does the agency concur? You'll notice that these are not open-ended questions. These are questions with great specificity, great clarity, and not a lot of loose ends for the agency to pull on. That's the goal of the kinds of questions we want to be asking the FDA. I can't tell you how many times I've seen anything but this get asked in communications with the FDA. Here's an example of what you might say. Hey FDA, we're planning to do a 30-person clinical trial on the basis of our statistical power analysis contained in Appendix A and described in our clinical trial protocol as shown in Appendix B. Does FDA concur that this is likely to be appropriate for clearance? That's a well-formed question to the agency. You wouldn't want to say, we're going to do a 5-person trial. What do you think? Right? It's saying, here's the basis upon which we believe that what we're proposing is adequate. We want to know if you concur. Or this example. Because our device design utilizing a blank for some component does not allow for current flow below some limit, we cannot reasonably provide current data at 100 ohms. Does the agency agree that our plan to provide data only above 100 ohms is likely to be adequate for clearance? That's a well-formed question, except for that extra question mark in there. Last example, and this is often applicable when the agency has come back to you in the form of a pre-sub or some other response to your queries. The agency suggested in its latest pre-submission written feedback, Q whatever, that we consider using testing to the consensus standard, fill in the blank, in lieu of custom testing. Maybe the FDA educated you that there's a standard out there that they really think would be good to use here. Probably don't have to, but they recommended you do it. This would be a well-formed response. We have elected this route and will provide the test results in our future pre-market submission package. Nothing further need be said. We just resolved that point. There's no ambiguity left. Unless something new and strange comes up, that point has been resolved. As long as we can pass that testing and can include it in our submission, we're going to be in good shape. Well, here's the non-answer. The FDA non-answer. And if there's one slide you take away from it today, I want it to be this one. So many times we have seen the FDA come back and respond to ambiguous questions that have been handed to us. We cannot determine if X will be acceptable. We strongly recommend that you submit detailed methodology for Y in a future pre-submission to obtain feedback on whether your approach would be appropriate. I don't know if it's obvious, but these are very veiled code words for we're not giving you any feedback on this point. You haven't provided us with anything of substantive value. Return to start and try again. In fact, this leads to one of the biggest pitfalls that we see. This goes back to the Cynefin framework. This goes back to the idea of not knowing the complexity of what you're involved in. Because many times we've heard this worst answer ever. We have a pre-sub response from FDA, so we know where FDA stands on our product. Well, that's simply not true. Because if one of the things that FDA said to you is, we cannot determine if this will be acceptable, we strongly recommend that you submit something, they're basically saying in kind or at least obscure words, what you gave us is completely impossible for us to evaluate. We're not going to give you our opinion. When these words are there, you know you've got a lot of work to do. Now, I want to give you a little example. But before I do, this usually happens when you provided hand-waving information to the FDA. If you said, oh, we're going to do thus and so, the FDA will inevitably come back and say, that's not enough information. Why don't you submit a detailed protocol to us? So a big part of regulatory de-risking is understanding at what point do I need to provide a sufficient level of detail. If you're having a pre-submission with the agency, actual protocols are frequently necessary. But you don't have to convince them of your final answer. That's for the actual submission. So understanding where in the process you are and how much detail is appropriate, often it's not enough detail, but you also aren't trying to convince the FDA of your final submission during early communications. Oftentimes, companies, especially academic researchers, and this is important for anyone who's involved in academic tech transfer, will provide articles in a pre-submission to the agency saying, we want you to see all the great work that we've done and include this in your evaluation of our product. And while this feels good at the outset to feel like I've got all this wonderful stuff I can provide to the agency, the reality is that what went into that academic research is not design-controlled product development. But there are major differences between what was done at the academic level and what gets developed during commercial development. But FDA doesn't have any way to disambiguate between these levels. So they're forced to evaluate it as though the article that you presented exactly describes the product you're currently developing. And of course, if you stop for a minute, you realize that academic innovators change what they're working on, even subtly, in between every single paper they write, because they're always trying to improve it. So as a result, this is a great place to build ambiguity, if that were your goal, with the agency by providing helpful, air quotes, articles to the agency. It's often worse than hand-waving. And finally, contradicting information. I can't tell you how many times this happens. The contradicting information gets provided to the agency by well-meaning teams. You say one thing on page 2, you say a different thing on page 12. The agency cannot read your mind. They have no way of knowing that you actually meant what was on page 2 and you missed what was on page 12. And I'd like to say that doesn't happen a lot, but sadly we've seen many packages brought to us where that's exactly what has happened. In fact, here's a case study. A company had multiple pre-market submissions to the FDA. They did not maintain their design controls, so the actual underlying documentation wasn't consistent and wasn't reviewed and wasn't vetted. The team didn't actually know what they had underneath. I'd like to say that's rare, but it's not. That means there were variations throughout the underlying documents, let alone the 2 submissions that had been created. And between those, they had not been harmonized. For example, single use versus reusable. It wasn't clear from the submissions whether the device was going to be single use or reusable. And as you can imagine, the testing that would have to be done is very different in both cases. Some of it is sterile packaging for single-use devices. For a reusable device, it's device longevity under cleaning and shelf life and lifetime of the product under local sterilization cycles. Very different testing, and yet this wasn't clear. The FDA came back across these multiple submissions with 40+ findings. Most were of the form I just shared with you. We eventually turned it around to successful clearance, but how did that happen? What was the process? How do you do that? How do you de-risk something like this? This is probably beyond risk because, in fact, the risks have been realized. You're in contradiction with yourself. You're in conflict with the agency. But nevertheless, using the term de-risking, how do you de-risk something like this? How do you ever bring this back? Well, here's the approach. First of all, clean up the underlying documentation. If you're under design controls, make sure you're following design controls like we spoke about last week. Clean up the submission package. Loose ends, like the kind we just described, are completely unacceptable in a context like that, but they're very frequent, even among professionally assembled submissions. You need to identify all the FDA's asks. They don't necessarily make this easy, although they do list them in a relatively linear format. But an Excel spreadsheet here can be the difference between life and death. If you can list what the FDA has actually asked you for, what they've suggested, and what they've just kind of noted for interest's sake. Respond to each. In responding to each, there's only a few choices to be made here. You can agree and give specifics. The agency said that we needed to do this form of testing. We agree with the agency's assessment. We propose to provide the test results from third-party testing in our upcoming pre-market submission. Great. You've just reduced the complexity, you've reduced the risk, you've agreed with the agency and said, we're going to do it. Now, you can't always do that. That's not always an option. So sometimes saying, well, we see what you're saying there. Would this satisfy you? You suggest the approach with specifics, and you ask the agency for agreement. Can you see how the only option is either clarity or agreement? This is where it has to be driven to. Only rarely, and never recommended, directly disagree with the agency or ask an open-ended question that has the opportunity to open up all sorts of new rabbit trails. The whole goal in a situation like this is to take ambiguity and reduce it to clarity. In a Cynefin framework, it's to reduce it to the clear domain, to the point where you do have a checklist. And that checklist is absolute clear agreement from the agency, even if they can't guarantee it, but nevertheless, roughly clear agreement from the agency saying, yeah, if you do that, we believe that'll be sufficient for clearance. Doesn't mean you've completely de-risked it, but it does mean you're well on your way, comfortable to finish the design, finish replication, finish testing, and get to that submission. So these examples that we gave earlier, great ways to do the kind of thing that we're talking about. But I want you to think, when it comes to regulatory de-risking, one of the big principles here is just reach consensus. Understand, clarify, propose, ask for concurrence. Don't reach beyond what is there. And that'll help you to de-risk these kinds of processes. Beyond that, educate, educate, educate. Knowing the words 510K and de novo don't help one bit if you don't know how to implement them. So prefer education and a snapshot in time, which will change, over a detailed plan that's probably wrong on day 2 of your project. Now, what happens when you've done all you can? We're not painting a rosy picture here that every single project can be planned out so perfectly and executed so flawlessly that you'll never run into any problems. And that's not the case. When you've done all you can, it's really back to the woodshed. There comes a point where you just have to do the heavy lifting, whether you like it or not. FDA hurdles that I know we've run into, despite best efforts and foresight and everything else, include things like realizing that the FDA is just not going to let you make more generic claims about things like inputs and outputs and compatibility of your product. So many products today, people want to make compatible with other products on the market, but if you don't own that product that's on the market already, it's hard to prove compatibility. As a result, you often find yourself going through more hurdles than scientifically you believe are needed. Your tech team will say this is not making sense, this shouldn't be required. You'll probably agree with them and nevertheless have to jump through some of those hurdles. So it results usually in way more testing. If you can't reach agreement on a predicate, we recently had the agency say to us, a device of this type does not exist, except that we were looking at one of that type, and we're not able to convince them otherwise. Well, sometimes weird things do happen like that. You have to press forward if you can't find a way around or go to somebody higher up or throw a red flag or whatever options are available to you. Sometimes you are forced to walk a path that is not ideal. Be ready for that. Increasingly, and we'll talk about this more in just a minute, FDA staff may not be trained. They may not be trained well. This can result in decisions not according to policy. And the question then becomes, do I fight it? Do I comply with it? What is going to be most efficient for this project in both the short and the long term? We'll talk more about this in a minute. And finally, and this is not an exhaustive list, insistence on clinical non-realities. There is a solution to it, but it takes time and money, and that is to bring in clinical experts. Again, after you've arranged a project as best you can and you're executing it, the FDA may say, we have concern about how this is going to be used clinically. We believe that there is an accompanying risk with your product. And sometimes you have to bring in clinical experts to say, no, that's just not how it works in the clinic. That's just not how it works in the clinic. And so you can fight through some of these things. Sometimes it is heavy lifting, and you have to be ready that you can't always achieve perfect agreement and then just execute it. So again, as important as de-risking is, that trip to the woodshed to get things done, to haul those logs, does become very, very important when you can't clarify it further. Lastly, let's talk about COVID's effects on the agency. There was an amazing, those of you who have listened to the show for a long time will know that there was an amazing early response from the FDA all across divisions, emergency use authorizations, FDA calling companies on weekends to try to help them get clearances for products. It was just absolutely incredible. We can't really sing the praises highly enough because of how they responded initially. It's understandable that a point of pause and recovery would come, as it has within the last year or so. There was even a point where there were no pre-subs happening, no discussion with the agency. Such a valuable tool, no longer accessible for a period of time. That's starting to recover. But replacing it is the unfortunate reality of employee attrition, staff attrition at the agency. Many times the remaining staff are undertrained. They started putting people who shouldn't have been reviewing things on reviews. Things got chaotic. And then eventually a number of very qualified staff left the agency. As a result, many times we're encountering staff who can't say anything negative about them, but they may not have been trained on how processes work. Things like breakthrough device submissions being treated as normal submissions, 2-week lead times turning into 45-day lead times. Things like that are happening, and you can't ignore it. The regulatory process is suffering from the aftermath of all the changeover post-COVID, and there's nothing you can do to take away from that reality. So those are some of the things that we're seeing. Well, that's a little bit about de-risking your regulatory strategy process. Educate, educate, educate. Understand that strategies and plans are only points in time. Prefer education over amazingly detailed things that won't last to day 2 of the project. But also understand that the only way you get real clarity is to talk to the agency. Talking to the agency with non-open-ended questions, where the agency can either say, yeah, that should be sufficient for clearance. We're not saying you're cleared, but that should be sufficient for clearance. Or where the agency can say, no, we need more information. And then when they do, come back with that extra information, give it thoroughly, and get to a point where they don't have any ambiguity so that they can give you that green light. It's a very simple process at base, but running that process over and over again is going to reduce the complexity, it's going to reduce the risk, and it's actually going to inform your team. How do I move this forward? And so that's what we want you to have in mind when you're thinking about regulatory de-risking. With a couple minutes we've got left, we'll take any questions or comments you may have. Feel free to raise a hand in the chat if you have any thoughts or questions. If we can bring them live, our friend Ken Spencer, who we haven't heard from in a little bit. Ken, it's great to hear your voice if I can get you live here.
Yes, can you hear me, Gene? Can you hear me there?
Just having a technical difficulty here. We'll get you.
Okay.
I can't hear him, but everyone else can. So everyone else heard the question.
I guess the question in the world of software as a medical device.
Yeah.
Does the FDA consider whether there are predicates outside of the use in the clinical area, that you're now bringing in, and say, look, this is kind of activity is used in all these other markets out here. We're now bringing it into the clinical environment. Will look at that as a predicate or not?
If you're saying something that's strictly outside of the, I won't even say clinical. If you're talking about something that is not a medical device, right, that it's not used in the diagnosis or treatment of a disease state or condition, then it doesn't count as a predicate, right? It's just a technology at that point. Maybe the more nuanced form of that question, which I think is interesting and perceptive, is if you are in one clinical domain, but you want to use it in a different clinical domain, and that's not part of the predicate, that's where it gets a little more interesting, because the intended use is what matters. But remember that in a 510K context, for example, which is where predicates matter, substantial equivalence to the predicate device is required. So it is to this day still possible to clear things that are not identically equivalent, but are substantially equivalent to the intended use of the predicate device. So you can get into some interesting waters there, but nevertheless, it's very much a, if it's not a medical device, then it's no chance it's a predicate. But if it is, you can get into some interesting questions based on intended use.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Always great to hear from you. We got a couple more minutes. We'll keep it open in case there's any other questions, comments. Yeah, really simple processes when it really comes down to it, but ones that your whole team needs to be vibing with to try to understand and say, how's this going to affect me? What am I going to do about this? How's it going to move me forward? Well, not seeing any more, we are going to have one more slide up here, which is the Unsplash.com credits. We've been enjoying Unsplash.com for a lot of the pictures that we use here on MedTech Crossroads in the last few weeks for this series. All of the pictures used today can be found through those QR codes. It's a fun service that is really just a marketing feeder for a lot of photography sites, but a very cool service nonetheless. So we'll give credit where credit is due. And with that, we welcome you back next week to week 4 of de-risking as we continue our discussion of how to de-risk your medical device development process. Enjoy the rest of this wonderful week, and we'll see you next week.